When Dilshad first learned his wife was pregnant, he smiled proudly for weeks. Not because he simply wanted a child, because he wanted a son. Someone carrying his name, someone becoming a real man beside him someday. At least, that's what he constantly told everyone. Inside the small neighborhood tea house, Dilshad laughed confidently with friends every evening. "My boy will become stronger than all your sons." People congratulated him already. His mother prayed loudly for a grandson. Even tiny blue baby clothes appeared before the child was born. Meanwhile, his wife, Shanoza, quietly stayed silent through all of it. Because deep down, she feared something painful. What if the baby wasn't a boy? One rainy night, the hospital finally called. Labor started suddenly. Hours passed painfully. Nurses moving quickly through white hallways. Shanoza crying from exhaustion. And outside the delivery room, Dilshad paced impatiently, waiting for only one answer. Finally, a nurse stepped outside, smiling warmly. "Congratulations, you have a beautiful daughter." Silence. Complete silence. The nurse's smile slowly faded, seeing Dilshad's expression. Because instead of happiness, disappointment entered his face immediately. Real disappointment, not hidden, not ashamed. The nurse awkwardly continued softly, "Mother and baby are healthy." But Dilshad barely listened anymore. A daughter, not a son. Inside the hospital room, tiny baby Yıldız slept peacefully beside Shanoza, completely unaware that her father already looked at her like a mistake. When Dilshad finally entered, Shanoza smiled weakly, despite exhaustion. "She's beautiful." Dilshad stared at the baby silently for several seconds, then coldly answered, "She should have been a boy." Those words shattered the room instantly. Shanoza's eyes filled with tears immediately, because suddenly she realized something terrifying. Her daughter entered the world already unwanted by her own father. Days passed afterward, and instead of bonding with the baby, Dilshad became colder every day. He barely held Yıldız, barely looked at her. Whenever neighbors visited, he forced fake smiles while joking bitterly, "Maybe next time I'll get a real child." Each sentence stabbed Shanoza deeper. But the worst moment came one cold evening months later. Yıldız cried loudly while Shanoza cooked dinner. The tiny apartment filled with baby sounds. Normal sounds, beautiful sounds. But Dilshad suddenly exploded angrily. "I'm tired of this." He slammed his hand against the table violently. Shanoza froze. Yıldız immediately cried harder from fear. Then Dilshad shouted the sentence destroying everything forever. "If she were a boy, maybe I'd feel something." Silence filled the apartment afterward. Terrible silence. Because in that moment, Shanoza understood something heartbreaking. Her husband wasn't struggling to love the child, he refused to try. That night, while little Yıldız slept quietly beside her mother, Shanoza cried silently, holding the tiny baby close against her chest, and softly whispered through tears, "I promise, I will love you enough for both parents." Meanwhile, inside another room, Dilshad packed a bag silently. No goodbye, no apology, only resentment. Then, before sunrise, he walked out of the apartment forever, leaving behind a crying wife and a little girl whose only crime was being born, a daughter. Years passed slowly after Dilshad left, and somehow life continued anyway. Because abandoned women learn something painful very quickly. The world does not stop for heartbreak. Bills still arrive, children still grow, and mornings still come even after people destroy your life. Shanoza worked endlessly to survive, cleaning houses, sewing clothes at night, sometimes skipping meals quietly so Yıldız could eat properly. The tiny apartment became colder every winter, but one thing inside it always stayed warm: her love for her daughter. Meanwhile, Little Yıldız grew up asking the same question repeatedly. Where's my dad? At first, Shinoza tried protecting her gently. He works far away. But children eventually notice missing love, especially father-shaped silence inside homes. One afternoon at school, during a family drawing activity, all the children drew mothers and fathers holding hands beside them, but Yıldız sat quietly, staring at blank paper. The teacher softly approached. "Why aren't you drawing, sweetheart?" Yıldız lowered her eyes sadly. "I don't know my dad's face." That sentence broke the teacher's heart instantly. And slowly, Yıldız began understanding something painful. Other children had fathers picking them up from school, fathers teaching them bicycle riding, fathers clapping proudly at performances. Meanwhile, she only had questions nobody answered fully. One evening, while helping Shinoza sew clothes late at night, Yıldız softly asked again, "Did Dad not love us?" Shinoza froze completely, needles stopping in her hands, because some questions hurt mothers too deeply to answer honestly. Still, children deserve truth eventually. Shinoza slowly looked toward her daughter, then quietly whispered, "He didn't know how." Yıldız stayed silent afterward, but deep inside, those words planted something dangerous. A little girl quietly wondering why she wasn't enough to be loved. Years continued passing, and despite hardship, Yıldız became extraordinary, intelligent, kind, hard-working, the kind of child pain matures too early. She studied harder than anyone else, not because anyone forced her, because somewhere deep inside, she carried one secret dream. Maybe if she became successful enough, her father would finally regret leaving her. Meanwhile, Dilshad lived another life across the city. New apartment, new friends, even another marriage later. And eventually, the son he always wanted. At least, that's what he believed would make him happy. But strangely, true happiness never fully arrived afterward, because people abandoning children often spend years pretending guilt doesn't exist, until silence finally becomes unbearable. One rainy evening, while drinking tea alone after another argument inside his second marriage, Dilshad noticed something unexpected on television: a local school competition interview, top student award, and standing proudly beside a microphone was a teenage girl named Yıldız. Bright eyes, confident voice, beautiful smile. The reporter softly asked, "Who inspired you most?" Yıldız smiled warmly. "My mother." Pause. "She loved me enough for two parents." Dilshad froze completely, because suddenly he recognized the eyes, his eyes, and for the first time in many years, something painful moved inside his chest. Regret. Real regret. Meanwhile, far away inside the tiny apartment, Yıldız sat beside Shinoza studying quietly under weak lights, completely unaware that the father who abandoned her had finally started seeing the daughter he never wanted. After seeing Yıldız on television, Dilshad could not sleep that entire night. Again and again, her words echoed inside his mind. "She loved me enough for two parents." Simple sentence, but somehow it cut deeper than insults ever could. Because suddenly, Dilshad realized something terrifying. While he spent years building another life, his daughter grew up learning how to survive without him. And worse, she learned to stop expecting him completely. The next morning, Dilshad searched for her school online secretly. At first, he told himself it was only curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, guilt had already begun quietly pulling him toward the child he abandoned. A few days later, Dilshad parked across the street from Yıldız's school during dismissal time. Rain touched the windshield softly. Children laughed while running outside. parents waiting proudly near the gates. And then he saw her, Yildiz, backpack over one shoulder, books pressed against her chest, laughing softly beside classmates. Older now, almost grown. And suddenly, Dilshad's chest tightened painfully, because for the first time, he truly saw what he missed. Not a daughter instead of a son, a human being, his child. Meanwhile, Yildiz noticed a black car parked nearby repeatedly during the following weeks. At first, she ignored it, but slowly, something about the silent man inside began feeling strangely familiar. One cold afternoon, while walking home alone, Yildiz accidentally dropped several books crossing the street, pages scattered everywhere. Before she could gather them, someone quickly stepped forward, helping silently. A man, tall, older, tired eyes. Dilshad. For one terrifying second, both froze completely, because standing face to face now, the resemblance became undeniable. Yildiz slowly stared at him confused, and deep down, something inside her heart recognized him before her mind did. Dilshad handed the final book back carefully, hands trembling slightly now. "Thank you," Yildiz whispered softly. Dilshad opened his mouth, trying to speak, trying to explain years of absence somehow, but no words came. Because what sentence repairs an abandoned childhood? Nothing felt enough. Finally, he only nodded awkwardly and stepped away quickly toward the car again, leaving Yildiz standing there confused in cold wind. That evening, Yildiz quietly asked Shanoza something unexpected during dinner. "Mom?" Long pause. "Does Dad have gray hair now?" Shanoza froze instantly, fear entering her eyes immediately. "Why are you asking?" Yildiz slowly lowered her eyes. "I think I saw him today." Silence filled the tiny apartment heavily, because suddenly, the past Shanoza fought so hard to bury had returned quietly to their doorstep again. Meanwhile, inside his car parked far away near the river, Dilshad sat alone gripping the steering wheel tightly, breathing unevenly, because for the first time in 20 years, he looked directly into the eyes of the daughter he abandoned. And horrifyingly, instead of feeling disappointment like years ago, he felt something much worse. Shame. Real, unbearable shame. Because suddenly, he realized the child he rejected became someone extraordinary without him, and the only thing his absence created was pain. That night, Dilshad quietly opened an old, forgotten box hidden inside his closet. Inside, tiny blue baby clothes waited untouched after all these years, the clothes bought for the son he never had. Dilshad stared silently at them for a very long time. Then suddenly, he began crying alone for the first time since leaving his family. Because finally, after wasting decades chasing the wrong thing, he understood the cruelest truth of all. He never needed a son. He only needed to love the child he already had. After their unexpected meeting, Dilshad could not stay away anymore. Years of silence had finally cracked open, and now guilt followed him everywhere, at work, at home, even while sitting beside the son he once believed would complete his life. Because suddenly, he understood something painful. Having a son never healed the emptiness inside him. It only delayed regret. Meanwhile, Yildiz quietly became suspicious too. The strange man near school, the familiar eyes, the way he looked at her like someone carrying old sadness. And deep down, she already knew the truth. Children often recognize abandoned love faster than adults realize. One afternoon after school, Yildiz deliberately walked slower than usual near the bookstore street, and exactly as expected, the black car appeared again nearby. This time, instead of avoiding him, she walked directly toward it. Dilshad froze, seeing her approach, heart pounding violently now. Yıldız stopped beside the car window, silently, then softly asked, "Why are you following me?" No anger yet, only painful curiosity. Dilshad slowly stepped out of the car. For a moment, he forgot every prepared sentence, because standing in front of him now was not the baby he abandoned. It was a young woman shaped partly by his absence. Finally, through trembling breath, he whispered, "I wanted to see you." Yıldız stared at him silently for several long seconds, then quietly asked the question, cutting through 20 years of silence. Why now? Dilshad lowered his eyes immediately, because there was no good answer, only ugly truth, cowardice, pride, regret arriving too late. "I made mistakes," he whispered painfully. Yıldız gave a tiny, bitter smile. "Mistakes?" Pause. "You forgot my birthday for 20 years. Those words hit him brutally, because suddenly he realized something horrifying. His daughter counted every missing year while he pretended time erased abandonment. People passed quietly around them on the sidewalk, cars moving, life continuing normally. Meanwhile, one broken father stood facing the consequences of his own choices for the first time. Dilshad slowly stepped closer carefully. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. True, painfully true, but I want to try fixing what I destroyed." Yıldız's eyes instantly filled with tears, not because she suddenly forgave him, because part of her waited her entire childhood to hear those words, and now they arrived too late to heal the little girl inside her completely. Then, softly, through trembling voice, she asked, "Was I really that disappointing?" Dilshad looked shattered hearing that, because suddenly he realized the deepest wound he created wasn't abandonment itself. It was making his daughter believe she was unworthy of love. "No," he whispered immediately, real tears falling now. "No, you were never the problem." Yıldız looked away, crying silently, because those words might have saved her childhood years ago. Now they only hurt. Dilshad carefully reached toward her hand instinctively, but Yıldız stepped backward immediately. Not hateful, just unfamiliar. Then, quietly, with tears running down her face, she said the sentence, completely breaking him. "You don't get to become my father now just because I turned out successful." Silence. Terrible silence. Because deep down, Dilshad feared exactly that truth. Maybe he only noticed her after seeing greatness. Maybe he would have stayed gone forever if she remained invisible. And suddenly, he hated himself more than ever before. Yıldız slowly wiped her tears afterward, then softly added, "I can regret leaving you, but you can't erase that you already did." Moments later, Yıldız walked away alone down the crowded street, and Dilshad remained standing there silently watching the daughter he never loved correctly disappear into the distance again. That night, Dilshad returned home emotionally destroyed, not angry, not defensive, only empty, because for the first time in his life, someone forced him to look directly at the damage he caused, and horrifyingly, his daughter was right. He did not come back when Yıldız cried as a child. He did not come back during birthdays, during school performances, during lonely nights asking why her father never loved her. He came back only after seeing her become extraordinary, and that truth poisoned him internally. Meanwhile, inside the living room, his teenage son Bekzad noticed something unusual immediately. Dilshad sat silently in darkness long after midnight. No television, no phone, only quiet regret. Bekzad slowly approached. "Dad?" Dilshad looked up tiredly, then forced a small smile. "You should sleep." But Bekzad stayed there awkwardly, because lately he noticed strange things too. The secret phone searches, old photographs, the name Yıldız appearing repeatedly, and deep down, curiosity already became suspicion. Finally, Bekzad quietly asked, "Who is Yıldız?" The question froze the room instantly. Dilshad's chest tightened painfully, because suddenly the lies keeping his second life comfortable began collapsing too. Long silence followed. Then softly, Dilshad answered, "She's your sister." Bekzad stared at him in disbelief. "My what?" Real shock now, because children never imagine parents carrying hidden families inside old regrets. Dilshad slowly explained everything afterward. The first marriage, Shanoza, the daughter he abandoned after birth, and worst of all, the reason why. Because she was a girl. The moment those words left his mouth, Bekzad looked physically disturbed, as if suddenly seeing his father differently. "You left your child because she wasn't a boy?" Dilshad lowered his eyes silently, ashamed. For the first time, fully ashamed. Bekzad stepped backward slowly, then whispered something completely destroying Dilshad emotionally. "If I was born a girl, would you leave me too?" Silence crushed the room, because suddenly, Dilshad realized his cruelty poisoned even the child he stayed for. "No," he whispered immediately, but Bekzad's eyes already filled with disappointment, because deep down, he understood something terrifying. His father's love once depended on gender, and children should never question whether love for them was conditional. That night, Bekzad secretly searched Yıldız online afterward. School achievements, interviews, photos beside Shanoza smiling proudly, and slowly, guilt entered his heart too. Because while he grew up with birthday parties and fatherly support, his sister survived life carrying abandonment instead. One old interview clip played quietly on his screen. The reporter asked Yıldız, "What made you work so hard?" Yıldız smiled softly. "My mother sacrificed everything for me." Pause. "And maybe I wanted to prove daughters deserve love too." Bekzad instantly covered his mouth emotionally, because suddenly he understood the pain hidden behind her success. Not ambition, wounded childhood. The next morning, Bekzad quietly entered Dilshad's office room before school. His father looked exhausted already, older somehow overnight. Then softly, Bekzad asked, "Does she hate you?" Dilshad looked away painfully. "No." Pause. That would hurt less, because hatred still carries emotional connection, but Yıldız's distance carried something worse, a lifetime of learning how to live without needing him. Weeks passed after Yıldız confronted Dilshad, and strangely, nothing felt stable anymore. Not for Dilshad, not for Bekzad, not even for Yıldız herself. Because once abandoned children finally hear apologies, old wounds reopen before healing begins. Meanwhile, Dilshad quietly tried changing, not through gifts, not through money, because now he understood material things could never repair emotional absence. Instead, he started doing something unfamiliar, thinking, really thinking, about every missed year, every birthday, every moment Shanoza raised Yıldız alone while he built another family pretending the past disappeared. And slowly, the guilt became unbearable. One cold evening, Dilshad drove alone through heavy rain after another exhausting business meeting. Roads slippery, visibility poor. But honestly, his mind barely focused on driving at all, because Yıldız's words still echoed inside him constantly. "You don't get to become my father now." Suddenly, bright headlights appeared violently ahead. Truck. Too close, too fast. Tires screamed against wet roads. Metal crashed loudly. Then, darkness. Hours later, inside the emergency hospital hallway, Bekzad stood trembling beside doctors, his mother crying nearby, machines moving urgently through corridors, and inside intensive care, Dilshad fought for his life. Internal bleeding, severe injuries. Doctors spoke quickly using complicated medical terms, but one sentence froze the entire family. "He needs blood immediately." Rare blood type, very rare. The hospitals searched desperately. No matches available fast enough. Bekzad tried donating first. Wrong type. Relatives arrived. Wrong type again. Panic spread through the hallway because slowly time began running out. Meanwhile, far across the city, Yıldız sat quietly studying late at night when her phone suddenly rang unexpectedly. Unknown hospital number. At first, she almost ignored it, then finally answered softly. The nurse's voice sounded rushed. "Are you related to Dilshad Karimov?" Instant silence. Yıldız's heart tightened painfully. Even hearing his name still felt emotionally complicated. The nurse continued quickly. "We found your records from family documents. You have the same raw blood type." Long silence filled Yıldız's room afterward, because suddenly the father who abandoned her needed something only she could give: her blood, her help, her life saving him after he spent years acting like hers didn't matter. Shanoza immediately noticed Yıldız's pale face afterward. "What happened?" Yıldız slowly lowered the phone, then whispered shakily, "He might die." The drive toward the hospital felt endless, rain hitting the windows softly, and inside the car, Yıldız's emotions fought violently: anger, pain, childhood abandonment, and underneath everything, something else still survived: humanity. Because despite every wound, some children still love broken parents silently. When Yıldız finally entered the hospital hallway, Bekzad immediately stood up, recognizing her from photos. And for one awkward, emotional moment, brother and sister stared at each other for the first time. Connected by the same father, separated by completely different childhoods. Bekzad's eyes instantly filled with tears. "You came." Yıldız nodded quietly, not trusting herself to speak yet. Moments later, while doctors prepared emergency transfusion equipment, Yıldız sat silently beside hospital machines, listening to the heartbeat of the man who once walked away from her cradle. And suddenly, she realized something heartbreaking. Despite everything, part of her still didn't want him to die, because abandoned daughters often spend entire lives hating fathers while secretly still wishing they had loved them properly. Inside intensive care, Dilshad remained unconscious, completely unaware that the daughter he rejected for being a girl was now the reason his heart still kept beating. For 2 days, Dilshad remained unconscious inside intensive care. Machines beeped softly around him, doctors moved quietly through white hallways, and outside the hospital room, his family waited in painful silence. Bekzad barely slept. Shanoza stayed only because Yıldız asked her to, and Yıldız herself sat near the window for hours staring silently at rain falling outside, because deep down, even she didn't fully understand her own emotions anymore. How do you save someone who once destroyed your childhood? How do you hate a father while still fearing his death? The answer hurt too much to explain. One early morning, a nurse suddenly rushed into the hallway, smiling softly. "He's awake!" Everyone stood immediately, heartbeat rising, fear, relief. And moments later, inside the hospital room, Dilshad slowly opened his eyes weakly beneath bright lights, confused, disoriented, alive. Bigzad instantly stepped closer emotionally. "Dad!" Dilshad looked toward him slowly, then around the room, and suddenly his eyes stopped. Yıldız stood quietly near the doorway, arms folded tightly, trying to protect herself emotionally even now. Dilshad stared at her silently for several long seconds, then weakly whispered, "You came." Tiny words, but full of disbelief. Yıldız looked away immediately, unable to handle the emotion inside his voice. Meanwhile, the doctor gently explained everything: the accident, the blood loss, the emergency transfusion, and finally, the sentence completely shattering Dilshad: "Your daughter saved your life." Silence filled the room instantly. Dilshad slowly turned toward Yıldız again, real tears already forming now, because suddenly the cruelest irony of his life stood directly in front of him. The daughter he once abandoned for not being a son was now the reason he survived. His breathing became uneven emotionally, and through trembling voice, he whispered, "Why?" Yıldız froze slightly, confused. Dilshad's tears finally fell openly now. "After everything I did, why would you save me?" The question broke everyone emotionally, because deep down, they all understood what he truly meant. He believed he didn't deserve it. Long silence followed. Then finally, Yıldız softly answered, "Because Mom didn't raise me to become cruel." Those words completely destroyed Dilshad internally, because suddenly he realized something devastating. The kindness saving his life came from the woman he abandoned too. Shinoza quietly lowered her eyes, crying silently nearby. Meanwhile, Dilshad looked toward Yıldız with unbearable regret, then weakly whispered, "I wasted your whole childhood." Yıldız's eyes instantly filled with tears again, because hearing him finally admit the damage hurt almost as much as the damage itself. Dilshad slowly tried sitting up despite pain. Doctors immediately protested, but emotionally, he no longer cared about physical pain, not compared to what finally crushed his heart now. He looked directly toward Yıldız, then whispered the sentence he should have said 20 years earlier: "I'm proud you were born my daughter." Yıldız's immediately broke down crying, because deep inside, a little girl waited her entire life to hear those words. Too late, painfully late, but real. And sometimes, even delayed love still reaches wounded hearts. Dilshad cried openly too now, not caring who saw, because finally, after wasting decades chasing the wrong dream, he understood the truth completely. A child's worth is never decided by gender, only by the love they carry inside their heart. After leaving the hospital, Dilshad changed completely. Not temporarily, not emotionally dramatic for a few days. Truly changed. For the first time in his life, he stopped living like a man protecting pride and started living like a father trying to repair damage. Slowly, carefully, he began showing up in Yıldız's life, not forcing closeness, not demanding forgiveness, only presence, the thing he should have given from the beginning. Every morning, he sent simple messages. "Did you eat? Good luck today. Drive safely." tiny fatherly sentences arriving 20 years late. At first, Yıldız answered coldly, short replies, polite distance, because abandoned children do not trust sudden love easily, especially from the people who once taught them how painful rejection feels. Meanwhile, Dilshad accepted every cold response silently, because deep down, he knew he deserved far worse. One afternoon, Yıldız unexpectedly arrived at his house to bring medicine doctors prescribed after surgery. Dilshad opened the door slowly and immediately froze seeing her standing there. For a second, he looked almost emotional just from the fact she came willingly. The house felt awkwardly quiet afterward, because this was the first time Yıldız entered the home her father chose instead of her. Family photos covered the walls, Beckside as a child, vacations, birthdays, years of memories. And suddenly, Yıldız felt something painful rise inside her chest again. Not jealousy exactly, grief. Grief for the childhood she never received. Dilshad noticed her staring silently at the photos. His face immediately filled with shame, because suddenly he saw the empty space where her memories should have existed too. Then, quietly, he whispered, "I should have had pictures of you everywhere too." Yıldız instantly looked away, fighting tears, because hearing regret from parents heals and hurts simultaneously. Later that evening, Beckside surprised everyone by sitting beside Yıldız awkwardly at dinner, then softly said, "I used to think Dad was perfect." Small, sad laugh afterward. "Now I think you're stronger than both of us." Yıldız looked at him surprised, because despite growing up with completely different lives, pain somehow connected them now. That night, while walking Yıldız toward her car, Dilshad stopped near the gate nervously, then carefully handed her something old, a tiny, unopened box. Yıldız slowly opened it. Inside, small blue baby clothes waited folded carefully, still untouched after all these years. Dilshad lowered his eyes painfully. "I bought those before you were born." Silence. Then, softly, through trembling breath, he continued, "I spent 20 years thinking those clothes represented disappointment." Tears filled his eyes again, but now they only remind me how blind I was. Yıldız stared silently at the tiny clothes, and suddenly she imagined something heartbreaking, a father waiting for a son so desperately that he failed to see the beautiful daughter already placed in his arms. Dilshad looked toward her carefully, then whispered, "If I could relive my life, I would run into that hospital room and thank God for you." Yıldız immediately began crying again, because deep down, every abandoned child secretly imagines alternate versions of the past where they were loved correctly. And hearing those words felt like mourning the father she should have had. Before leaving, Yıldız quietly hugged him for the first time in her life, not fully healed, not fully forgiving, but no longer completely distant either. And while Dilshad held his daughter carefully through tears, he understood something painful and beautiful at the same time. He could never erase the lost years, but maybe, if he loved her honestly now, the future did not have to stay broken forever. Months passed slowly after the hospital incident, and for the first time in their lives, Dilshad and Yıldız began building something fragile together. Not a perfect relationship, not easy forgiveness, only slow healing, the kind requiring honesty every day. Meanwhile, Yıldız's success continued growing. Top university, awards, scholarships. People everywhere admired her story, the hard-working girl raised by a single mother who never gave up. But only a few people knew the deeper truth hiding behind her strength. Part of her ambition was built from childhood pain. One spring afternoon, Yıldız received an invitation to speak at a large education conference honoring successful young women. Students, teachers, families, even local television reporters attended. At first, Yıldız almost refused, public speaking always terrified her emotionally, especially when discussing family. But Shinoza gently encouraged her. You survived harder things than microphones. That made Yildiz laugh softly, and eventually she agreed. The conference hall filled completely that evening. Bright lights, elegant stage, huge audience waiting quietly. And among them sat Dilshad, nervous, hands trembling slightly, because this was the first important event in her daughter's life he ever attended, 20 years late, but finally there. Meanwhile, Yildiz stood backstage breathing unevenly, speech papers shaking softly in her hands. Then suddenly, she noticed Dilshad sitting near the front row beside Shinoza and Beksad, watching her proudly already, and strangely, instead of anger, she felt sadness. Sadness for all the years he missed seeing her shine. Moments later, her name echoed across the hall, applause filled the room, and Yildiz slowly walked onto the stage beneath bright lights. At first, her voice trembled slightly, but gradually, confidence returned. She spoke about education, hard work, single mother surviving impossible situations. And slowly, the audience became emotional hearing her honesty. Then, suddenly, Yildiz paused, long silence, eyes scanning the crowd carefully, until finally they stopped on Dilshad. The room became completely still, and softly, Yildiz continued. When I was little, I believed something was wrong with me because my father didn't stay. Dilshad instantly lowered his head emotionally, tears already forming. Meanwhile, the audience listened silently. Yildiz's voice shook now. But as I grew older, I realized children should never carry shame for adults' mistakes. Several people in the audience quietly wiped tears already. Then, softly, with heartbreaking honesty, Yildiz added, I spent years trying to become successful enough to deserve love. Pause. But children already deserve love the moment they are born. Dilshad completely broke emotionally hearing that, because suddenly he understood the deepest damage he caused. His daughter spent childhood proving her worth when she should have felt loved naturally from the beginning. Yildiz looked toward Shinoza next, then smiled through tears. My mother taught me something beautiful. Real parents are not decided by gender expectations, but by who stays when life becomes difficult. The audience erupted into emotional applause. Meanwhile, Dilshad openly cried beside Beksad without even trying to hide it anymore. Then finally, Yildiz looked toward her father one last time before ending her speech, and softly whispered the sentence completely destroying him. But today, my father came. Silence filled the hall heavily. Then, through tears, she smiled gently. And sometimes healing begins with simply showing up. Dilshad immediately covered his face, crying harder than ever before. Because after wasting 20 years running from fatherhood, his daughter still left space in her heart for healing. And deep down, he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to become worthy of that mercy. Summer arrived softly that year. Warm wind moved through open windows. The city felt alive again. And slowly, life began healing in ways none of them expected. Not perfectly, some wounds still existed, some memories still hurt. But now, love finally existed beside the pain too. Dilshad changed his entire life after Yıldız's speech. He stopped chasing approval from other men, stopped caring about outdated ideas of sons carrying family names, because finally he understood something simple and devastating. A child is not valuable because of gender. A child is valuable because they are yours. Every week, Dilshad spent time with Yıldız now. Simple things. Tea together. Driving her to university. Listening to her talk about dreams and fears. Moments ordinary fathers take for granted. Meanwhile, Dilshad treated every second like a miracle returned too late. One evening, while organizing old documents at home, Dilshad unexpectedly found something hidden inside a drawer. An old notebook belonging to Shinoza. Curious, he slowly opened it and instantly froze. Inside, every page contains memories about Yıldız's childhood. First steps, first words, first school day, tiny achievements, and beside many entries, one heartbreaking sentence repeated again and again. She asked about her father today. Dilshad's hands trembled violently now, because suddenly he realized abandonment wasn't one moment. It repeated thousands of times through childhood. Every birthday, every school event, every lonely question without answers. Then, suddenly, one final entry near the back shattered him completely. Tonight, Yıldız cried herself to sleep asking why she wasn't enough for her father to stay. Dilshad collapsed into the chair crying uncontrollably because, deep down, he finally understood the full weight of what he destroyed. Not only a marriage, a little girl's sense of worth. That night, Dilshad drove toward Yıldız's apartment immediately, despite heavy rain. When she opened the door, she instantly became worried seeing his face. "Dad?" The word still sounded new between them, beautifully new. Dilshad stepped inside silently, holding Shinoza's notebook tightly. Then, suddenly, he broke down crying in front of her completely. Real, uncontrollable crying, because pride no longer mattered. Nothing mattered more than truth now. "I'm sorry," he whispered repeatedly, over and over, for every birthday, for every tear, for every moment you thought you weren't enough. Yıldız's eyes instantly filled with tears too, because hearing parents finally acknowledge pain heals something deep inside abandoned children. Dilshad slowly looked toward her, then whispered the sentence carrying 20 years of regret. "You were the greatest thing God ever gave me, and I almost lost you forever because of my own stupidity." Yıldız immediately hugged him tightly, crying into his shoulder. And for the first time in their lives, father and daughter truly cried together, honestly. No pride, no distance, only love finally arriving after decades of silence. Meanwhile, outside the apartment, rain continued falling softly across the sleeping city. And somewhere inside that quiet night, a little girl who once believed she wasn't enough finally understood the truth. She was never unworthy of love. Her father was simply too blind to see her value before. Months later, Yıldız graduated university with highest honors, and this time, when she walked across the stage proudly, Dilshad stood first among the crowd, clapping louder than anyone, tears filling his eyes again, because now he no longer saw the daughter he once rejected. He saw the child who taught him the greatest lesson of his life. Sometimes the blessing people pray for is already standing in front of them. Never make children feel unwanted because of gender. A daughter is not less valuable than a son. Children do not choose how they are born, but parents choose whether those children grow up feeling loved. And sometimes, the child you almost rejected becomes the greatest blessing of your entire life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because some stories are not only emotional, They remind us how deeply children remember the way parents loved them.